There is a psychological truth about empaths that nobody talks about, and it will change how you see every relationship in your life. Here is what most people get dangerously wrong. They mistake emotional depth for weakness. They see kindness and assume vulnerability. They see someone who feels everything and think they have found easy target. That is their first mistake. Because when you betray a deeply empathic person, you do not break them. You activate them. What happens next is not grief, not collapse, not revenge. It is something far more permanent, far more powerful, and completely invisible to the person who caused it, because they never understood who they were dealing with in the first place. What activates inside an empath after betrayal is not emotional damage. It is an irreversible psychological transformation that makes them nearly impossible to manipulate ever again. And today, we are going to go deep into exactly how that happens. There is something happening right now inside millions of people that psychology textbooks completely ignore. Not because it is rare, because it is uncomfortable to explain. Most behavioral research focuses on the person who causes harm, the manipulator, the betrayer, the one who breaks trust deliberately. Scientists study their patterns. Therapists analyze their motivations. Society debates whether they can change. But almost nobody stops to study what happens on the other side, what happens inside the person who trusted completely and got destroyed for it. And I want you to stop for a moment. Really stop, because what I am about to share with you is not motivational content. This is not feel-good psychology. This is behavioral truth that most people spend their entire lives never confronting, because confronting it means admitting that the people we loved most were capable of something we never imagined. Betrayal is not an event. That is the first thing you need to understand. Most people treat betrayal like a moment, like a single conversation, like one discovered lie or one broken promise. They think healing means getting past that moment, moving forward, finding closure. But that framing is completely wrong, and it is why so many good people stay stuck for years without understanding why. Betrayal is a systematic dismantling of someone's internal world. Think about what actually happens inside the mind of a deeply empathic person when trust is broken. It is not just pain. It is a full cognitive collapse of everything they believe to be real. Every conversation they ever had with that person now carries a question mark. Every memory becomes evidence in a trial they never asked to be part of. Every moment of kindness they gave is now being re-examined under a completely different light. Did any of it mean anything? Was I being studied instead of loved? Was my openness being used as a map, a blueprint for someone to know exactly where I was most vulnerable? Those questions do not arrive quietly. They arrive at 3 a.m. They arrive in the middle of conversations with other people. They arrive when a song plays or a familiar smell hits, and suddenly the empath is not standing in the present anymore. They are back inside a memory that no longer means what they thought it meant. This is the pattern that behavioral science consistently underestimates. We talk about trauma responses. We talk about attachment wounds. We use clinical language that keeps a safe distance from the raw reality of what actually happens to a good person after deep betrayal. But the clinical language misses something critical. It misses the specific kind of damage that happens when someone with genuine emotional depth, someone who loved without strategy, trusted without conditions, stayed without obligation, finally discovers that everything they gave was being received by someone who never intended to honor it. That specific experience does not just hurt. It rewires. And here is the part that changes everything. Here is the behavioral truth that most people never reach because they stop at the pain and never look at what the pain is actually building. The human mind under that kind of pressure does not simply suffer. It adapts. It reorganizes. It starts developing capabilities that were completely dormant before the betrayal happened. Pattern recognition sharpens. Emotional radar expands. The ability to detect inconsistency in words, in tone, in behavior becomes almost automatic. The empath who trusted everyone begins developing the ability to read everyone. And that transformation does not happen slowly. It does not happen gently. It happens the way all real growth happens, through pressure that felt unbearable until suddenly it wasn't anymore. That is where this story actually begins. Let me tell you something about empaths that most people fundamentally misunderstand. And I mean most people, including the empaths themselves. When we use the word empath in casual conversation, people immediately picture someone who cries easily, someone who gets overwhelmed in crowds, someone who takes everything personally and needs extra time alone to recover. Society has packaged empaths into this very specific, very limiting image, the overly sensitive person who feels too much and handles it poorly. That image is not just incomplete, it is completely backwards. Because what behavioral science actually shows us when we study deeply empathic individuals is not fragility. What we find is an extraordinarily sophisticated psychological profile. A person whose nervous system is processing emotional information at a level most people never reach. A person who is not simply feeling more, they are perceiving more, detecting more, absorbing information from human interactions that the average person walks right past without noticing. Think about what that actually means in practice. An empath walks into a room and within minutes they already know who is uncomfortable. They already sense where the tension is sitting. They notice the person in the corner who is smiling with their mouth but not their eyes. They feel the shift in energy when two people who had an argument earlier are now pretending everything is fine. None of this is mystical. None of this is supernatural. This is advanced pattern recognition operating through emotional intelligence, and it is one of the most powerful human capabilities that exists. But here is the painful contradiction at the center of an empath's life. The very sensitivity that makes them extraordinary also makes them a target for the wrong kind of people. Because manipulators, narcissists, and emotionally immature individuals are drawn to empaths like a pattern they instinctively recognize. They sense the warmth, they feel the unconditional understanding. They experience the rare comfort of being around someone who listens without judgment, who gives without keeping score, who stays when everyone else would have already left. And they take advantage of every single piece of it. This is the us versus them dynamic that nobody wants to talk about directly, but behavioral patterns make it impossible to ignore. There are people in this world who genuinely connect, who give emotionally because connection is meaningful to them, who build relationships based on mutual respect and real investment. And then there are people who consume, who enter relationships looking for what they can extract, who perform connection without actually feeling it. The tragedy is that empaths are specifically conditioned to see the best in people. They do not enter relationships looking for red flags. They enter relationships extending genuine trust because that is how their psychology operates. They assume emotional sincerity because they themselves are emotionally sincere. They project their own internal world onto others and assume a shared depth that simply does not exist in every person they meet. And this is not a flaw. I want to be very clear about that. This is not weakness disguised as kindness. This is not naivety that deserves punishment. An empath's willingness to trust deeply is actually a sign of psychological courage because real trust requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires genuine strength. The problem is not the empath's capacity for trust. The problem is that they are operating with a completely different set of values inside a world that contains people who do not share those values, and nobody warned them clearly enough about that gap. Because once an empath truly understands this distinction, once they stop assuming everyone feels the way they feel, everything changes. Their radar shifts. Their decisions change. Their entire relationship with trust evolves into something far more powerful than blind faith. It becomes conscious, chosen, and nearly impossible to exploit. I want to get specific with you right now, because this is the part where most conversations about empaths and betrayal stay frustratingly vague. People talk about pain. They talk about healing. They use words like growth and transformation and inner strength, and all of those words are true. But they never actually show you the mechanism. They never show you what is happening inside the mind and behavior of an empath during and after betrayal at a granular, observable level. And that specificity matters, because without it, understanding stays surface level. Without it, the empath cannot recognize what they are experiencing as something real and documented, not just personal suffering that exists only inside their own head. So let us go there. The first behavioral shift happens before the empath even consciously registers the betrayal. And this is the part that is genuinely fascinating from a psychological standpoint. The body knows before the mind admits it. There is a period, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, where the empath starts feeling something they cannot immediately name. A low-level unease. A slight distance in conversations that did not used to be there. A moment where they laughed at something and then noticed the laughter felt hollow. A gut signal firing quietly underneath the surface of normal daily life. Most empaths during this phase do something very specific. They rationalize. They explain away the signal. They tell themselves they are overthinking. They convince themselves that the discomfort is their own anxiety rather than accurate perception, because the alternative is a truth they are not ready to face yet. This is not weakness. This is the psychology of deep attachment operating in real time. When we are emotionally invested in someone, our mind creates what behavioral scientists call a consistency bias. We naturally interpret incoming information in ways that protect the existing belief we hold about that person. So the empath who is trusted deeply does not immediately see betrayal. They see confusion. They see misunderstanding. They see a version of events that still allows the person they love to remain who they believed them to be. But the signals keep coming. And eventually, through one discovered truth, one conversation that does not add up, one moment where the mask slips completely, the consistency bias collapses. And what follows that collapse is one of the most behaviorally complex experiences a human being can go through. The empath does not just feel pain, they experience a complete recalibration of reality. Every interaction they replayed in their mind now gets re-examined through a completely different lens. The memory of a conversation they thought was intimate now looks like information gathering. The moment someone seemed vulnerable now looks like performance. The apology they once accepted as genuine now reveals itself as a tactical reset, a way to buy more time and maintain access. This recalibration process is exhausting in a way that is almost impossible to explain to someone who has not experienced it. Because it is not just emotional exhaustion. It is cognitive exhaustion. The empath is essentially rebuilding their entire understanding of a relationship, brick by brick, while simultaneously managing the emotional weight of what that reconstruction reveals. And during this process, something else happens that is critical to understand. The empath's communication patterns change visibly. People around them notice it without understanding it. Responses get shorter. Availability decreases. The warmth that used to flow naturally becomes measured. The person who once initiated conversations now waits. The person who once explained everything now says almost nothing. From the outside, this looks like withdrawal. From the inside, it is something completely different. It is the empath's nervous system finally, after absorbing enormous amounts of emotional damage, switching from open processing to protected processing. The psychological gates that were always left open are now being selectively controlled for the very first time. And that shift in behavior is not the end of something. It is the beginning of everything. I need you to sit with something uncomfortable for a moment. Because what I am about to describe is the part of this experience that nobody talks about honestly. Not therapists in their carefully worded sessions. Not self-help content that wraps everything in hope and healing. Not the people around the empath who watch the transformation happening and call it by the wrong name entirely. What I want to talk about is the silence. Not the silence after betrayal. Not the quiet that follows a difficult conversation or a relationship ending. I am talking about something far deeper and far more psychologically significant than that. I am talking about the specific, heavy, almost unbearable silence that lives inside an empath while the betrayal is still happening, before anyone else knows, before the empath themselves has fully admitted it, when they are carrying the full weight of a truth their heart has not yet given their mind permission to speak out loud. That silence has a texture. And if you have ever experienced it, you know exactly what I mean. It sits in your chest like something unfinished. It follows you into rooms full of laughing people and makes you feel completely alone despite being surrounded. It shows up in the middle of ordinary moments, washing dishes, driving somewhere familiar, sitting in a meeting, and suddenly the weight of what you already know but refuse to fully acknowledge becomes almost physically heavy. This is where the real psychological tension lives. And here is why this specific phase matters so much from a behavioral standpoint. The empath during this period is managing a cognitive split that requires enormous mental energy. On one side of their mind, they are maintaining the relationship, showing up, responding, performing normalcy with a level of emotional discipline that most people could not sustain for a single day. On the other side of their mind, they are processing a growing mountain of evidence that everything they believed about this connection was carefully constructed to serve someone else's needs. Holding both of those realities simultaneously without breaking, that is not weakness. That is one of the most demanding psychological feats a human being can perform. But the tension keeps building, because the empath's nature will not allow them to simply switch off their perception. They notice everything. A slight change in tone during a phone call. A moment of eye contact that lasted half a second too long before looking away. A response that came slightly too quickly, as if it was prepared rather than genuine. An unexpected defensiveness over something completely ordinary. These micro signals land in the empath's awareness with a weight and clarity that the average person would never register. And each signal adds pressure to a psychological container that already has very limited remaining space. What makes this phase particularly devastating is the isolation it creates. Because the empath cannot easily share what they are experiencing? Not yet. Partly because they are still hoping they are wrong. Partly because the betrayal often involves someone deeply embedded in their life, someone whose reputation would be affected, whose relationships with mutual people would shift if the truth came out. And partly because the empath knows from experience that when they share pain before they have processed it fully, people offer solutions instead of understanding. So they carry it alone. And alone is a very specific kind of difficult when your entire psychological makeup is built around deep connection. When your nervous system is wired for intimacy and honesty and genuine emotional exchange, isolation is not just lonely, it is disorienting. It feels like being cut off from oxygen in a room where everyone else is breathing normally and nobody notices anything is wrong. The pressure inside continues mounting. Every day that passes without resolution adds another layer. Every forced smile costs something real. Every normal conversation conducted over the top of something enormous drains energy the empath is running increasingly short on. And underneath all of it, underneath the maintained composure and the continued functioning and the daily performance of being okay, something is shifting at a level much deeper than emotion. The empath's entire relationship with trust is being fundamentally restructured in real time. And that restructuring, silent, invisible, and completely misunderstood by everyone around them, is building towards something that will permanently change who they are and how they move through every relationship that follows. The tension does not break dramatically. It does not explode outward the way people expect. It collapses inward, quietly, completely. And what rises from that collapse is something the person who caused it never anticipated and will never fully understand. I want to speak directly to you right now, not to an audience, not to a general concept of someone who might relate to this. I mean directly to you, the person who is watching this and feeling something shift inside their chest because some part of what you have heard today is not new information to you. It is recognition. It is the strange and slightly overwhelming experience of hearing your own internal world described out loud by someone else, in words you never quite found for yourself. That feeling is important. Do not dismiss it. Because one of the most isolating parts of being a deeply empathic person is the persistent belief that what you experience internally is too complicated to explain. That your emotional depth is something other people will misread as drama. That your sensitivity is something you are supposed to manage quietly rather than something that deserves to be genuinely understood. So you compress yourself. You edit before you speak. You translate your real experience into a simpler version that other people can receive more comfortably. And in doing that translation, you lose something every single time. You lose the full truth of what you actually went through, and that loss accumulates, quietly, over months and years of giving people a reduced version of your inner world because the full version felt like too much to ask someone to hold. You start believing the reduced version is all you deserve to express. You start treating your own depth like an inconvenience instead of recognizing it for exactly what it is, one of the rarest and most powerful psychological qualities a human being can possess. So I want to anchor something in you today that may take time to fully settle. What happened to you was not a reflection of your worth. The betrayal you experienced, whether it came from a partner, a friend, a family member, or someone you trusted completely without reservation, was not evidence that your trust was wrong. It was not proof that your openness was a mistake. It was not the universe confirming that people like you, people who feel deeply, love genuinely, and give without constantly calculating the return, are destined to be taken advantage of. It was evidence of who they were, not who you are. That distinction sounds simple. It is not, because betrayal does something very specific to empathic people that it does not do to everyone. It attacks identity. It targets the core belief system that the empath has built their entire way of moving through the world upon. The belief that genuine care is real, that loyalty means something, that the emotional investment you make in another person will be honored, not perfectly, not without mistakes, but honored in the way that matters most, with sincerity. When that belief gets violated at depth, the empath does not just question the relationship, they question themselves. And that self-questioning is where the most invisible and most lasting damage lives. Not in the anger, not in the grief, But in the quiet moments where the empath looks at their own reflection and wonders whether their capacity for love is actually a liability, whether their willingness to trust is simply a more sophisticated way of setting themselves up for pain, whether the emotional world they inhabit so fully and so honestly is a world they should have been protecting more carefully all along, those questions feel true in the darkness. They feel logical. They feel like conclusions reached through evidence. But they are not conclusions. They are wound speaking. And there is a profound difference between a wound and a truth, even when the wound is articulate, even when it constructs an argument that sounds reasonable, even when it has gathered enough emotional evidence to present a convincing case against your own worth. A wound wants you to shrink. A truth expands you. And the truth about who you are, the real behavioral, psychological, human truth, is that your capacity to love deeply after being hurt deeply is not weakness wearing a disguise. It is the single most courageous thing a human nervous system can do. Because the easier path after betrayal is closure. Hardness. Building walls so high and so thick that nothing meaningful can get through in either direction. That path is available to everyone and it requires almost nothing. But you did not choose that path. Or if you did, something in you kept finding ways back toward openness. Kept reaching toward genuine connection despite having every logical reason to stop. That is not naivety. That is not a pattern you need to fix. That is the rarest kind of human strength there is. And it deserves to be seen, clearly, completely, and without apology, for exactly what it is.